It's very easy for anyone who's played on Wrath private servers over the last 10 to 12 years to turn around and say, oh, but Naxx is too easy. I've said it myself on videos, and Naxx, it is easy, but you're taking the words from people that have been doing this day in, day out for years. Back in 2010, the guys over at Engadget had a retrospective look at Wrath of the Lich King raids, and one of those raids was, of course, Naxxramas. The problems that existed in the original Naxx will exist to a certain extent today. If you're unfamiliar with my previous videos where I've spoke about things like Phase 1 content in Wrath of the Lich King, I've said things like making the Phase 1 content more difficult, i.e. tuning the raid. I've also mentioned things about making Phase 1 shorter. Even though this post is old, it covers all of our concerns that we've got about Naxx and what the current Blizzard team can do differently. And strangely enough, one of those is actually making it a short phase. I will post a link to this article in the description below if you want to go and have a read through it, but we are going to cover everything in it anyway. So when people talk about raiding in Wrath of the Lich King, a lot of complaints often boil down to Naxx. It was out too long before a new tier of content. That's what I'm saying about making it a short phase 1 or people will get bored and fall off. The fights were too dumbed down for the original raid's difficulty and it was too easy. It was an unimaginative way for Blizzard to cut corners and save time developing Wrath. While I'm personally critical of Naxx as a raid instance in its current implementation, let's look at the points and discuss their validity. So again, already in the opening statement we've got, it was too long and it was too easy. Naxx was out too long before the new tier of raid content. This one's pretty subjective, but we can consider two factors. First, Naxx went live with Wrath's release in November 2008, alongside Malygos, also known as Eye of Eternity, and Sarfarian, also known as Obsidian Sanctum. Malygos' itemization was half a tier superior to that of Naxx itself, so that items that dropped in the 10-man version of Eye of Eternity were equivalent to those that dropped in 25-man Naxx. Malygos 25 drops were superior to anything that dropped in Naxx off of anyone but Kel'Thuzad himself, so while we could say that this entire tier of the raid lasting from launch until the release of Ulduar in April, it's unfair to single out Naxx as the sole offender. Furthermore, Trial of the Crusader launched in August 2009, meaning that Ulduar's duration as the top tier of raiding was only a month shorter than that of Naxx, EOE, and OS. Are we really arguing that the 20 bosses of those combined 3 raids had so much less raiding potential that an extra month or so wasn't at least subjectively justifiable? Now, we already know, or we will expect, Phase 1 should be short. It should be almost the shortest phase, I would say. And then obviously Phase 2, we're looking at Ulduar really being the longest phase, I would say. Well, that and Icecrown, obviously, the last phase. Well, not last phase because we've got Ruby Sanctum, which everybody forgets about. But either way, our worries and concerns about the phases, and if you saw our podcast, The Dalaran Sewers, check it out. We spoke about all the phases with Willie, and actually all of this lines up pretty well with what we've been saying. In regards to the fight difficulties, they were dumbed down from the original raid difficulty. It was too easy. Not only is this reason extremely subjective, it also somewhat misses the point. Naxx 40 was the ultimate raid of vanilla WoW, the end of the road. In effect, it was the blueprint for Sunwell and ICC. The fights were the cutting edge of raid encounter design, the gear, the ultimate in vanilla's itemization. Compare that tanking sword with BC blue drops for an idea of just how good Naxx 40 itemization was. You could walk into Karazhan in Naxx 40 gear and lose nothing, while if you walked into Naxx 10/25 in Sunwell gear, you were in fact missing out on blue drops from instances that were actually superior to Sunwell gear. And then as a side note, you could still run Naxx 10/25 in Sunwell gear, it just wasn't as crushingly superior to leveling gear as Naxx 40 gear was. Also, another interesting point that we've been talking about recently, is it worth running Sunwell? I've put a video out saying, should you run Sunwell Plateau? And my ultimate answer for it was, well, yeah, if you just want to have some fun and you want to just raid because you enjoy raiding, absolutely. But if your sole purpose is preparing for Wrath of the Lich King, then not really. There's not that much point. And they even recognised this as far back as 2010, or June 2010 when this was written, that the difference between going into TBC with full Naxx gear and the difference between going into Wrath with full Sunwell gear is night and day. It's so far apart because the item level jump and the superiority of the items in Wrath of the Lich King through the leveling process and from the pre-raid gearing is just far superior to what we had in TBC to replace your vanilla gear. Now, asking the introductory raid for Wrath of the Lich King to be as difficult as the final raid of original World of Warcraft is not only absurd, I'm not even sure it's feasible. Naxx 40 had 40 people in it. You could see fights that demanded 7 or 8 tanks to complete. Given the constraints to adapt the ultimate 40-man raid experience into one that could be experienced by 10 or 25 players, Naxx is in fact a triumph of fidelity from its original format. It made changes only when doing so was necessary, either from a storyline perspective, i.e. Mograine can't be there, he's somewhere else, or because asking 2 tanks to do what 8 once did, or throwing all that healing pressure once handled by 7 or 8 healers onto 3 would be absurd. And that's absolutely true. And actually, Naxx is not that bad. If we're talking fun perspective, we're talking, will you enjoy Naxx? Yes, you absolutely will. Will it be a challenge? No, it won't. But now let's think. Was Molten Core a challenge? No, it wasn't. Was Karazhan, Gruul, and Magtheridon a challenge? No, it wasn't. Why would the first tier of content in this expansion be any different? We expect it to be an introductory raid to the expansion and it not be that difficult. But is that what people want? You know, talking about community-wise, is that what people want? Do people want to go in and just basically have a raid full of pinatas that you're just going to get loot out of? Or do you want it to be a little bit difficult? Would it be nice to have the option to have the health and the damage boosted in these raids? Like flat 20% across the board, even if there was no extra reward, it's just purely just for fun. I don't know. Let me know in the comments. So converting Naxx to a 10-25-man raid was an unimaginative way for Blizzard to save time developing Wrath. This, to me, seems at once the most reasonable and yet most inaccurate criticism of Naxx 10 and 25. It's the most reasonable because it's easy to see why people would think this. It is, after all, fundamentally the same raid space, the same models, and as close as they could get to the original fights. Just pick it up, plop it in Northrend, and tune the fights for different levels and numbers, and we're good to go, right? No way. First off, it's clear that an enormous amount of modelling and itemization work was done before the decision to use Naxxramas as a raid in Wrath. From the item names and design of the instance in question, as in extra portals, huge hallways, we can speculate about where and what those raids would have been, but it's clear that choosing to adapt Naxx did little, if anything, to save anyone any work. Making the decision to turn Naxx into 10-25-man raid characters 20 levels higher than its original design was, if anything, required a ludicrous amount of work for the developers. Compare just the differences between Lower Feb in current form and his original form. Adapting a fight that not only had 40 players to 10 or 25, but also had consumable mechanics and different raid comps. You know, no Shamans and Paladins in the same raid, no Death Knights of any kind. It requires so much work that it would actually be easier to start from scratch with an entirely new raid, rather than trying to hold on to the feel of an old encounter. As to the imagination required, it's hard to dispute that the reason was much less we can't think of anything, since clearly they had thought of at least 2 other raids that Naxx displaced, and much more the stated reason of letting people get to see a raid very few saw in vanilla. Having discussed these concerns, it would also be dishonest for me to pretend I was unabashedly happy with how Naxx 1025 was implemented. Most of my own difficulties with the instance as a whole came from the conversion process that moved it from top tier of level 60-40-man raiding to the introduction to level 80 10/25-man raiding. Frankly, using the space to the original Naxx 40 for 10-25-man raids left the place feeling deserted and empty. Trash pools were much fewer as a necessity, which led to rooms and hallways that felt ludicrously underutilized. Making my way from the level 80 version of Anna Brecken to Mayexna for the first time, I got the overwhelming sensation of taking a trip to a deserted old mall that had once been bustling but had now fallen on hard times. Furthermore, while the developers did do some masterful work converting Naxx to a level 80 raid, the place where the conversion feels the most strain isn't at all in moving from 60 to 80, but rather in moving from 40 people to a variable size of 10 and 25. It's my belief that it is the variability of raid size at level 80 that is the culprit. Frankly, 10-man raids work best when designed for 10 people, and 25-man raids work best when designed for 25. The challenge of changing a 40-man to one of these 2 raid sizes is already pretty severe, but to then make a raid that works in either size at once is adding another hurdle to the jump. Some raids feel best in one size over another. To my mind, ICC 10 feels stronger, better designed, and more epic at times than ICC 25, while the opposite is true for Ulduar. Your mileage may vary. Mine does vary, but I absolutely agree. ICC 10 Heroic, I love. I actually prefer ICC 10 Heroic over 25, and I think most of the bosses on 10 Heroic feel more challenging than 25 Heroic, if I'm honest, just because you haven't got all that room for error because you've only got 10 people. Whereas Ulduar absolutely is better on 25, but I still love it on 10 man as well. But that makes perfect sense. Some raids do feel more satisfying on 10 man over 25. However, in Naxx, I'm of the opinion that scaling down to 25 or 10 was hard enough, and then having to be capable of flipping the switch between those 2 sizes was almost insurmountable. Additionally, and to some degree this is an unavoidable consequence of updating content from 2 expansions ago, Naxx just doesn't hold up visually compared to Wrath's other raids, especially big tent peg raids like Ulduar or ICC. Don't get me wrong, Naxx is a gorgeous raid instance, the absolute best of the best we had to experience in original raiding. But after not only seeing innovations and improvements in BC raids like TK, SSC, Hyjal, BT, and Sunwell, but they're moving into entirely new territory with Wrath. Naxx looks like what it is, an old raid. The revamped Tier 7 gear often looks inferior to its original Tier 3 models, and the original weapon models available through Naxx 10 don't even try to really update the old models. To my eyes, this wasn't really as much an issue until Ulduar dropped, with its astonishing art design absolutely making Naxx look older and more tired just by existing. I don't want to argue just for the sake of arguing, but I don't really agree with that. I don't think there's anything wrong with Naxx when you go in, and I did Naxx 40. Don't really bother me. You know, I quite like the fights in Naxx, but I just don't want to be doing them for like 6 months. And then finally, there were the achievements. While achievements have improved over the course of the Wrath raid cycle, in my opinion, it would not be unfair to say that the way they were implemented in Naxx was often completely shoehorned into the instance. The Immortal/Undying was an absolutely grueling test, not only of your raid and its ability, but also whether or not everyone managed to have a completely flawless internet connection for every single fight. Frankly, with Drake Lust the way it was back then, those two achievements ended up with more swearing and tears due to stories like, we had a perfect Immortal run until one of the healers DC'd on Hygen. And that's it really, but that's a real good retrospective look. It's a good article. I'll put a link in the description if you want to read it through without my boring, mundane voice over it. But I just wanted to share it with you guys because it really is just backing up everything we've been saying on the podcast or on videos on this channel, or even other content creators, what they're talking about on other channels as well, is the fact that phase 1, you need to strap yourself in. It's an alt phase. That, for me, that's what it is. I don't want it to be super short. I want it long enough to get my 3, 4, 5, level 70s up to level 80 and start raiding on them all, So I don't want it to be super, super short, but we just need to be mindful that if it's too long, people will start getting bored and drop off, like they actually did at the beginning of Wrath of the Lich King. This is not unknown territory. We know what to expect. The Blizzard developers know what to expect. So they should be making plans for that now and understanding that it's fine to have an easy phase 1, but don't drag it out. And certainly don't have it longer than phase 2, because Ulduar we want lots of time in. Nice short phase 1, big, long phase 2. That would be my dream. But anyway, if you enjoyed the video, make sure you like, subscribe, consider joining the channel as a member, and roll the outro. There's lots of ways you can support the channel to keep me here putting out World of Warcraft content and covering all future MMOs. Consider joining the channel as a member. You get access to emotes, everyone will know you're a member when you comment on future videos because you get a nice icon next to your name, and you get access to members-only videos, which I'll be putting a lot of on the channel throughout the year. Additionally, there's a Patreon link in the description as well. Thank you for watching all the way to the end, and I'll see you on the next one.